All right. Hello to everyone and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Carlo Bobilas and I'll be your moderator for this session. Today's session will be presented by Security Solutions Architect and Cisco Press author, David Hauk. But before I hand over the mic, I do have a few housekeeping items to cover about today's session. Today's session will be recorded and made available on demand after the live session. We'll make sure to provide those details at the end. Also, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. So if you are on WebEx and have questions for our speaker, please feel free to send it through the question and answer panel, where our wonderful panelists are ready to respond. And for those tuning into our live stream, thank you very much for joining in as well. Q&A is limited to those via WebEx. However, we will have a post-event Q&A thread over on the Cisco Learning Network community where you can actually post any follow-up questions you might have. So without any further ado, I'd like to kick things off by welcoming our presenter, David. David, over to you.
Thanks, Carlo. Appreciate it. Go ahead and share my WebEx or my PowerPoint. So today we'll be talking about policy and governance. The goal is to have a zero trust mindset to a defensible security. But before we get started, my name's David, and I'm a security architect, as Carlo mentioned. I've been at Cisco for almost 13 years. I've been about 20 years in IT and networking. I have expertise in healthcare, financial, manufacturing, energy sectors. I work across the board, but those are the areas where I've focused a lot. I have focus in XDR, remote and hybrid work, network segmentation, policy definition, and optimization. Outside of Cisco, I like motorcycles, I like drones, I like to create content, edit videos, and I like to travel. So maybe you'll see me out on the road one day. But let's get into the presentation. To start off, I want to leave everyone with a thought. There are risks and costs to a program of action, but they are far less than the long-range cost of comfortable inaction. That was stated by John F. Kennedy, 35th US president, and it is very, very key. There's a very key quote to a lot of things in networking, specifically cybersecurity. And you'll find it if you do a lot of searches on cybersecurity. It's used in a lot of places. The goal is that when we go on a program of zero trust, it's going to be risky. It is going to be costly. It is going to take time. There are things associated with that that aren't comfortable. But the cost of not doing anything is a lot larger. And it won't happen today. It'll happen sometime in the future, but it will happen. So as we move forward, just think about the difficulties of some of the items that propose to your organization, both from the top down and the bottom up. And then also think about what you can do to help facilitate that program of action. So let's talk about policy and governance and where it falls in zero trust. In the zero trust architecture book, we define 5 pillars and capabilities inside of those that are controls that help enable zero trust in an organization. The first one, which we're covering today, is policy and governance. Policy and governance is going to be, in this scenario, the least technical of all the sessions. And the reason why we want to have this to be the least technical is because it forms the framework for all the configurations, all the policies, everything that goes into the identity, vulnerability management, enforcement, and analytics pillars of the zero trust capabilities. So as we move forward, we'll talk about those items that control and govern what we're going to do when we implement devices, when we create designs, when we put configs on a device. And a lot of those documents should be found in a single source of truth. And a single source of truth should have all the documentation that you need to move forward inside of your cybersecurity program, but also your entire organization's operating structure should follow these documents. Specifically, in a cybersecurity program, you're looking for the strategy, organizational documents, roles and responsibilities, documents that guide how you're going to implement those things and who's in charge of what from a position in your business. There are other things that guide what the proper way to go about enacting these things, such as the Code of Business Conduct, reporting guidelines, risk management documents that tell you how that should be done inside the organization. But then also, there are things like regulatory requirements, legislation, business policies, standards, things that external organizations are going to apply to you that you need to follow. And inside of all of that, there are things inside the business that you need to accomplish. We're doing this for the organization's mission or strategy. That should always be the end goal of everything we do within the cybersecurity program. The controls inside the pillar of policy and governance that this type of documentation should touch are going to include change control, your data governance policy, data retention policy, business continuity, disaster recovery, risk classification policy, some of your segmentation pieces. These things are going to be covered in that cybersecurity program. And what is the goal of that cybersecurity program? The goal of that cybersecurity program is to facilitate and govern your cybersecurity policies and a support of cybersecurity controls. That's to promote the alignment within the organization's mission and strategy. Whether it's a firewall rule or a access control access control policy or an access policy, let's say within ICE, you're going to have a policy that goes to a control. So I may have an authorization policy that supports the control of virtual private network. Well, why do we have virtual private network? We have that virtual private network in order to align with some goal, some mission to allow folks to get to resources so the business can operate. And one of the things you'll find is as the business evolves, these documents should evolve as well. I want to bring us to the first Slido poll. So here's a QR code if you want to get out your phone, look at the QR code. There's ZTPG at slido.com is another way you can join the poll. The passcode is Cisco ZT. I'll leave this up for a second. So I'll have 3 different polls and we'll view the results live. So we'll start with the first one. So we still have the QR code and all the information to join here on the left-hand side. The first question I'm going to ask, and all of these are opinions. I want to get how people feel. How often should an organization and review and update its cybersecurity policies? And we'll just see as the results start coming in. And give it a full minute. So it looks like we have a tie for first. Oh, well, there we go. We have a few coming in. So the answers to this question are going to vary based on your organization. Some of these may be controlled by your policy documents. Some of these may be controlled by they may be controlled by your policy documents. They may be controlled by a regulatory agency. They may be controlled by many different things. You should always be thinking about when should review, when's an opportunity to review something to change. All of these are correct answers. However, for me, I think 4 and 5, where we're ranked today, are one of the ones that trigger most of the changes. If you're only reviewing after a significant incident, yes, you should always review after a significant incident. But if you're only doing it after a significant incident, well, maybe the significant incident wouldn't happen if there were other reviews. There's also changes in the threat landscape, and then of course required by compliance regulatory changes. You're going to have to do those. But you should also, which is why I like the way people are answering, you should have a time-based review as well, because the other two are event triggered, and it's best to not have an event surprise you. I really appreciate everybody participating in the poll. We'll move forward to the next. So let's talk about zero trust and cybersecurity programs. What are we trying to accomplish in our cybersecurity program with zero trust? Because the document and the policy and the governance and all of that should feed into what our cybersecurity program is trying to do. And there are two ways to look at it. You can look from the top down or the bottom up. They should always meet in the middle and push beyond the boundary a little bit, but there are responsibilities. The goal of zero trust is to establish your trust, enforce trust-based access, continually verify that trust, and respond to any changes in trust. You only get to a resource if you need. And if your need changes, your access changes. If something about your posture or your identity or any piece of something that we deem as important changes, your access should change. Now, when we talk about top down, the goal of a board of directors, of the CISO, of the C-level suite, and folks down the line is to ensure a legally defensible cybersecurity program. If you've kept track, these things are legal issues here in the US. People can be prosecuted if they are grossly neglecting that requirement, that responsibility. One of the main ways this can be done is maintaining your governance and documentation as you need to push them out to the organization. You want to empower not just cybersecurity readiness and responsiveness, but the folks who power that. So you have to give and delegate those responsibilities, accountabilities to other folks within your organization. But in the end, all of that is going to go straight to a business outcome. How do we come to what the organizational goal, mission, or strategy is? How do we make money? How do we get this product out? How do we serve our clientele? Cybersecurity programs should secure the process to do that, reduce the risks to that flow. And if you're taking ITIL or if you've been through the ITIL process, you might be thinking about the service chain. These are places where that risk management comes in because at some point security does become overburdening. Security can actually subtract from the goal, the business strategy, the mission. And that's where from the bottom up, the responsibilities really kick in. Because those organizational policies, I can't expect my CISO to be able to write an access control policy. I can't expect them to write an authorization and authentication policy or an access policy or an email rule. I can't expect them to do that. But what I can do is I can help mold those rules based on what those responsibilities are that they have deemed down to each of the individual organizations within the sub-organizations within the organization. You can translate that and say, hey, this supports this document. And you should have always in that mindset that this policy supports this goal, supports this document, supports the business. You should always be able to link what you're doing to the business or the mission. Life cycle of technologies, that would mean hardware, software, code. A lot of people think just hardware and software because of being in networking, but there's also code. There's also applications that are programmed. The number of times I've seen a homebrewed application that has a single hard-coded IP address or has really, really narrow timings, so any latency will upset the application. Those things are risks and they have to be addressed. And sometimes there are things within that or that documentation as far as development of applications, especially in-house, that should address those things because those are places where vulnerabilities could be exploited. There's also regulatory and legislative controls that you have to report on to say, hey, my controls are this effective. Here's an audit, or here is a pen test, or here is some kind of marker that says, hey, our controls are effective. Because anyone can install a firewall, anyone can install an IDS, an IPS, an X something, and the detection and response. But unless you're testing it, just because I have alerts doesn't mean it's working. I have to be able to test it. What happens if I try to do something that would invalidate my trust? Does that thing get blocked? Does that access get restricted? Do I quarantine? Do I contain? And all these things will be in those documents because those high level documents will also be supplemented by documents as we go down. We're going to support the daily operation and availability of those assets that are protected. And not just the protected assets for the sake of the protected assets, but for the sake of the non-protected assets that we have to interact with. Nothing is a closed ecosystem. And then as things happen, remediate those variances or issues found in those protections. So if you have a rule or if you have a some kind of item that keeps you from being able to do that one thing you need to do, such as let's say VPN connectivity, you have old ciphers and you see that, hey, we picked up ECDHE and well, we're no longer using the least secure. Well, you may have to make changes. You may have to re-sign certificates. You may have to change your PKI. You may have to move from one technology to another as you move forward. So these are all things that you can do and then feed up the chain that then allow the operation of the mission or the strategy to be more effective, to be more secure. So this will be the second poll question, and I want to ask, what do you believe is the most important factor for ensuring the success of cybersecurity policy in an organization? What do you feel is the most important factor? So the possible the possible answers that we have here are training and awareness. If you're taking your CISSP, that's something that you will see a lot of. There's a lot of certifications, there's a lot of things going into that regular employee training and awareness. But that doesn't happen without strong leadership. Incident response and recovery plans are very important. If you get affected, how do you get back into business? Continuous monitoring and risk assessment processes, all of these are super important. All of these should be being done. And then integration of cybersecurity into business processes. I love seeing the training because that's what we're doing today is in training and awareness. I'm hoping that through this, we're at least highlighting something you haven't seen or considered when looking at your cybersecurity policy or how you interact with your cybersecurity policy. But all of these are pieces and all of these are factors. So I appreciate the participation, I really do. And we'll move on. So let's talk about applying policy control. So now let's get to the technical, the nitty gritty. And we're not going to talk about specifically configurations, but we're going to talk about how do we take vague documentation and refine it and refine it and refine it and come up with something that actually works in a configuration. That's the most difficult part. How do we create that rock solid policy that follows everything we're trying to do without going too far or without falling short? And that's all about identifying your low level controls. And these are things like change control, QoS, redundancy, replication, segmentation, and then of course how all the documentation applies to a workflow. And that's what makes zero trust so difficult to wrap your head around if it's just a small effort. That's why it takes a lot of folks from a lot of different walks of life to sit down and talk about how do we get those things done for the business. So let's say in order to have this business, to have a remote employee, we need to get to a private out app. That can be in your data center, that could be in some kind of infrastructure as a service. In this case, it's going to be web SSH RDP is what's needed for this private app. You're going to have different places where security barriers are set. The endpoint is one of those. The data center is another. Places where you want to protect what is behind that place of security. And not just protect inwards, but also protect outwards. Think about data exfiltration. And of course, your data center is a big part and your application is a big part. Each one of these security boundaries have to have their own controls. And we'll talk about these controls in the future webinars, but all of these controls need to have their own configurations. They need to have their own settings. They need to have everything that goes into making it work. Without understanding the flow, you don't know what you're handing off to. You don't know how to interact with the other pieces of that control or other controls within that same technology group. So as you're looking for configs, make sure that you're allowing those things that need to be allowed to make those controls effective. So your DNS security may need special rules to restrict DNS from one place and enforce DNS and allow it in others. Or you may have devices that, like your IP address management system that have to provide DHCP and provide certain DNS. You may have Duo or one of the other multi-factor authentication providers. You may have to use SAML. There's all kinds of things that go into that workflow. Those configurations should follow up the design and the other pieces of documentation that should exist in your organization. But what are these documents? There are two types of low-level documentation controls that we have in place. So the control of low-level documentation say, hey, if I had to build this thing from scratch, how do I do that? And it's not necessarily going to have, it's not going to have every configuration, but it's going to say, this is the configuration that we will be using to accomplish this. Maybe not the exact, but we use access control list here, or we use email policies here, we use DNS policy there. These controls are all going to fall in two different columns. You're going to have governance controls and policies controls. So governance controls are going to be the things that you use to make sure that your controls are going to be effective. Your security baselines, your design of your architecture, your processes, any kind of documentation that refers to how the environment is built, from physical to logical, best practices, change control, regulatory compliance. All of these things are incredibly important in understanding how we're going to configure our devices, how we're going to implement our devices, how that design goes. But that's all into how we work. Yes, it will dictate some configuration. You may have a security baseline that says no service password recovery. But those are just to protect the controls. Those are to instantiate and protect the controls that actually have the policies on them. And you're going to have access control policies, QoS policies, endpoint policies, network policies. You're going to have all kinds of things. And segmentation policies is one I'd like to touch on for just a second. From a segmentation perspective, it's really easy to get in the mindset of everything needs its own segment. A phone needs its own segment. A printer needs its own segment. Oh, I'll have an iPhone, I have an Android. Mobile devices need their own segment. Well, also do BYOD devices. And that's where a lot of times mistakes are made. Because if I go back up the list and I say, where does that specific segment fall into the business and what does it serve for the organization goal, mission, strategy? I might not have an answer. There may not be a reason for the phone to exist in its own segment. The phone might exist with the endpoints, with printers, with laptops, with all these other devices, because the segment is just to separate. It may not actually be the rule. You're going to have access policies, QoS policies, posture policies to enforce other parts of your policy. And then what happens when something fails? Scalability, availability. You can create, I've seen so many times where you have an access control list that is massive. I've seen access control lists longer than configurations and ACI. And that's just the access list. That can cause scalability problems with your firewall, regardless of vendor. Your log generation, I don't know how many folks here, but the number of times I've heard, hey, we turned on this logging and this logging was too much for us. I've seen that. That's, again, one of those things we have to go back to say, well, what are the practices for our data retention policy? It may need to be changed because the cost may not be worth the retention. But then there may be regulatory or other controls that keep you, or regulatory or legislative controls that keep you from changing that to something lower. And so the costs have to be weighed against the risk or the thing that they're preventing. So the cost of it versus the cost saved off of it. Which brings me to the final poll question that we have today. In your opinion, what's the biggest challenge in implementing effective cybersecurity governance within your organization? This is a big one. It's going to, this should reflect how you kind of feel. This should reflect what you see in your organization, or maybe what you see you're doing well in your organization that other organizations don't do. I've seen some organizations, they have a very, very expansive lab. They have a very expansive DevOps or DevSecOps, and then others that literally have nothing. In the end, the answers all play a part. And if you don't see something here that you want to share, there is a space that will be shared afterwards where you can continue the discussion. List something you think is a big challenge, or list something that blocks what cybersecurity program can do, or other things that may trigger the review of a cybersecurity program. And some of these do kind of fold into each other. You may have insufficient support from the top level management. That may be because you have a lack of budget. So some of these tie together. So it looks like we have insufficient support from top management, lack of budget and resources, difficulty in keeping up with compliance and regulatory requirements, complexity of an organizational's IT infrastructure. I've seen that be really, really difficult because you don't know, you can't create a policy unless you know what's in your network. And sometimes your organization's so complex, you don't know. New threats. There have been a lot of threats that are old threats that have been in the news recently. And then an employee awareness and adherence to policies. That goes back to the first question, training, right? So in the end, what I hope we have given you is a understanding of some of the pieces that play into having a zero trust mindset to your cybersecurity policy. And remember, cybersecurity policy just isn't the cybersecurity guys gobs, but it's everybody's responsibility. Everybody needs to have a hand in security, whether you're in technology or not. Now, obviously, this group, we're all in technology in some form or fashion, but always think as you're doing your day to day, what are the costs of what I'm doing today? What are the risks of what I'm doing today? And is it because I'm acting or is it because I'm not acting? Is it because my organization is acting or not acting? Is it because my group is acting or not acting? Hopefully this can get the conversation started on how and why we should be securing our environments beyond just, oh, well, to keep the environment safe or have a super complex password because, well, then people are just going to write it on post-it notes and stick it under their keyboards. Those things happen. What can we do in a program of action to reduce the risk and reduce the costs of keeping the status quo? So that's the end of the presentation part of today's webinar. One of the things that I wanted to share is this zero trust architecture, the book that was written. Uh, you can scan this QR code and you can use the discount code zero trust. You get a 40% off. That is good until I think August 31st. So this is the age of QR codes. So, hopefully everybody has their camera out, but if you don't, you can just go to the Cisco Press and use that. So any
Right.
questions or concerns or comments?
Yeah, I want to go ahead and thank you, David, again. So again, we'll go ahead and take some time to take questions. Just as a reminder, please be sure to type your questions into the question and answer panel. So while we wait, let's see here. Let me go ahead and keep that slide going. Give me one sec. And we'll put that last slide so that you can keep that QR code handy.
So
All
I
right.
do
So,
I
oh,
do see
sorry,
a
go ahead.
question. I do see a
Oh,
question. Due to the advancements of cyber threats, don't you think the government should set up protecting the business and citizens the same the military protects the country? Well, that's actually a great comment because in question, because we kind of already do. We have organizations that protect us from state actors that are constantly working, the NSA, FBI, CIA, they all play a part in that. But then also the military has their own cybersecurity folks that protect the military, and of course, threats from other militaries. There are a lot of state actors out there and a lot of state sponsored actors. It is very important that the government is on top of cybersecurity. I know that's a little bit more prevalent in the EU. The European Union has a lot of initiatives going on. And so that's very important that we do get involved with local, state, and federal politics when it comes to cybersecurity. And that's something that's hard because not necessarily a lot of the folks in those governmental roles, in those elected roles that are defining the organizational or the legislative docket are knowledgeable about cybersecurity in any kind of way. So it is very important that governments take notice, and I think they are. I think there are more that could be done. I know that there are parts of the current U.S. government's administrations that are doing that in multiple different places. So it's something that does need to be taken on.
Awesome. Thank you very much, David. A question just came in. I went ahead and answered it, but just wanted to talk about it a bit more. So the recording as well as the presentation slides will be made available on the Cisco Learning Network. It takes about 3 to 5 business days for the recording itself to be edited. But what we'll do is we'll put the unedited version onto our Cisco U YouTube platform channel so that you can actually immediate playback right after the session ends. So we'll get that posted uh, hopefully soon. Yeah. Um, David, there's a question that came in. How do governance frameworks assist organizations in managing cybersecurity risks?
Yeah, there are lots of different places frameworks come in. It depends on what organization you're in, what vertical you're in, what sector you're in, public sector, private sector, whether you're in healthcare. But there are a lot of different frameworks. I mentioned ITIL can help you with kind of building that. That's not a governance framework. That's more of a way of doing IT. When you talk about frameworks, you're really talking about ISO 27001, the NIST cybersecurity framework. So, 800-207 for zero trust, 853, COBIT. Uh, there's all kinds of different ways that organizations can identify those risks and implement controls. And that's really what the framework is to do. The framework is there to help you do those things, to monitor the effectiveness of your security measures and maturity of them. And there's, common language and definitions that get set in those that enable you to say, hey, we've done what we need to do. We are resilient. We we properly assign trust. We properly make sure that we're protecting the customer, the shareholder, the individuals inside the organization. So these are all parts of frameworks and how they can assist you in making sure that your cybersecurity risks are addressed.
Thank you. Okay, another question came in. Dimitri asks, or I don't know if he actually is a question, maybe a statement. It says, would you not have something like Cisco validated designs for ISO 200 policies, for examples, templates, or templates of policies is what he's saying.
Yeah, so there are validated designs and there are design guides as far as individual technologies and the way you would want to put them together and building templates. But from a design perspective, the idea of the validated design is to say, hey, here's how you do one thing. When you're looking at a broader architecture, there's the safe architecture, which is heavily integrated into the zero trust architecture that we have. That's all on Cisco.com. It's all about building architectures because we can't provide one configuration or one group of configurations that meet all of the different dependencies that would a business would need to have to properly implement their controls, right? because I may be told that when I deal with the government, I have to be FIPS compliant. And when I don't deal with the government, I may not have be FIPS compliant. And a curveball is sometimes in the same organization, I have a set of ciphers and crypto security that is higher than FIPS. So how do I address that? Um, an architecture will help you do that. A white paper doesn't necessarily help you do that. So when we get into validated designs for specific products and specific technologies and specific environments, yes. But when we really talk about how can I use something to become more ISO 27000, 27 K compliant? Well, or I may need to become NIST compliant or may need to become FIPS compliant. Usually it's the architecture that helps you get there. Now there are some white papers and some validated designs on like FIPS, but the reality is you want to use those frameworks to give you the goals you need to design towards so that your architecture meets those. And then that architecture then, yes, would have a validated design that it underlies as the foundation. So I may have a validated design, but I would also need to put in maybe some security controls or baselines on top of that.
Awesome, thank you. All right, moving on. I do have another question is, what are some common elements included in a cybersecurity policy?
So cybersecurity policies, some of the common elements that you're going to have is like the scope. I do consulting, so scope is always big for me. Like, why am I here? What am I doing? And what's within my scope? You're also going to have who has to do those things, roles and responsibilities. I may have a team that's responsible for my PKI. Well, I will. A team that's responsible for this. They may be different or the same teams, but I'm going to have a RACI that determines that. Then there's data classification, protection, and retention. It tells you how you should treat data. That's another piece of it. Then, of course, access control. So here in network, there's network security. There is a lot of stuff about access control. So you're going to have access control policies, authorization and authentication policies. You're going to have uh, all kinds of controls to control access, even physical access. Incident response and reporting is another piece of that. So when something happens, how do we respond to it? How do we report it? If you look and see a breach or a cybersecurity incident with a publicly traded company here in the US, they're gonna have to file with the SEC for that. And you can find that and say, hey, here's how it's going to affect us. That's also part of reporting. And it may not be a technical piece of the reporting, but it is an important part of the cybersecurity policy because you need that defense. Part of it is to protect the company, the shareholders, the operation. Laws and regulations, there are going to be certain laws, regulations, and things you have to follow. User education or awareness, that's another piece of a cybersecurity policy is, hey, we implemented this control. Well, how do we communicate that control out? And I would say probably the last thing I would say is just regularly reviewing and updating those. And I know it's something we covered. You want to make sure that you're regularly reviewing and making sure that you're renewing at least the last time this thing was reviewed and the documentation. So the documentation should be changing every time you review it and say, hey, we looked at it this date. Maybe some notes about did we change or not change and why did we do and not do that?
Awesome, thank you. So Dimitri, just follow up in the previous question. He stated SMEs are always lacking resources, budget. Having some templates, such as architecture design examples, policy templates, would help to drive the company into the right direction. Just an FYI. Thank you very much for that feedback. I'll make sure to pass this along to our. I can pass it along to the Cisco validated design team as well too. So
Mhm.
thank you for that. All right. Next question is, how can organizations measure the effectiveness of their cybersecurity policies and governance?
So there are lots of ways you can do that. and that's where frameworks come in again, is how can you measure the effectiveness? So what's the maturity? But regular audits is one big piece. So when you have someone coming through doing an audit, I remember when I worked in the office in TAC, one of the things that would happen is we had these little badge, extra badge pieces on our badge holder. And it would be like, hey, if someone comes in and asks you, what's Cisco's sustainability policy? Where can you find this documentation? The goal was, hey, I know, and that's part of the education, that if I need to answer those questions, or, what is the specific thing that we may be asked? Hey, I've got that here on my badge and I can easily look at it. It's a easy tool for me to say, hey, I know, even though I don't know what the policy is, I know how to find it. I know how to get there. Um, and that, a lot of those are also risk assessments to say, hey, maybe there's a gap. You may have someone, an auditor come in and say, hey, this door is not properly seated for the data center, or I could plug into this device, into this port, and I get full internet access, or I get full access to the internal network. But also, that's where you can set up KPIs and key performance metrics into what you're doing. Uh, like your incidents, the number of incidents, your response times, compliance rates, uh, also testing your incident response plans, gathering feedback when those things happen. Maybe an employee gets really upset because somebody came in and grilled them on something they didn't know. How can we prevent that from happening in the future? Or maybe we implemented this new software and maybe we didn't communicate it properly. And of course, one of the bigger things is benchmarking. So there are many places where you can get benchmarks for devices, for different for policies, for incident rates, for resolution rates, for response times. And benchmarking yourself against the industry is a good way to say, hey, how good am I doing? Those are all good ways to measure. Um, but usually, if the only person measuring you is yourself, that may have problems. So, having a third party do that is always good.
Awesome, thank you. Uh, One of our attendees mentioned COVID-19, or yeah, what was it? COVID-19 provides a great framework and map out applicable standards and regulations.
Yes. COBIT, TOGAF, those are all really good. Um, those are all really good frameworks. And then of course your industry specific, you know, uh, it's one of those things where you may have like NERC or FERC for critical infrastructure protection, NERC SIP, and other things. So, you know, just keep an eye on what's relevant, not only for the general, but also for your specific organization.
Yep, thank you. Okay, I believe we have another question that came into the chat is how can we ensure that every access request to our network and resources is authenticated, authorized, and continuously validated, regardless of the user's location or the network they are connecting from?
That's an excellent question. There are recently there's been a huge influx towards on client, posture assessment or other controls that may come into play that live on the endpoint. There are other things that may be outside that do inward scans or may redirect traffic based on that, based on the trust level of that individual. And it might not even be an individual. It may just be an asset. It may just be a server. I mean, that's something. Um, it starts with a framework of making sure that you determine what is allowed from point A to point B, and writing rules and making sure that you have responses when those situations change. So a lot of things happen in automation. A lot of things happen on timers. Posture happens on timers. Some things are automated to say, hey, this new thing opened up. So maybe I open up maybe I had this new service come up in the cloud. And so maybe I have to open up this new IP address or this new port or create this new service. All of these things are very important. It's going to be different for every organization, but continuous reassessment of the endpoint, whether that be a laptop, a phone, a server, constant reassessment, and then of course having good, clear, structured rules of how these applications and assets and endpoints should communicate. Um, you know, uh, from a Cisco perspective, Cisco Secure Client uh, has a lot of stuff that can help you with that posture. But it's going to take other things. Like if you have Secure Client, you're do posture, you might do ICE posture. And that could apply not just when you're on VPN, but also when you're off VPN. It may change your access.
Thank you. Another question came in. Do Cisco devices give off signatures that could be detectable and recognizable in foreign lands?
It Yes, I mean everything does. There's always a way to detect, hey, this is a Cisco device, or there's always some kind of reconnaissance. Um, the goal of a cybersecurity program should be to limit that ability to do reconnaissance. Um, and that's not always a Cisco product, right? So I saw a question, what about third-party cyber controls, best practice recommendations? I mean, that's something that's huge. Like if you're relying all on one thing if you're just relying on one firewall to get everything done, somebody can get around that, then you have no other protections there. So you need a defense in depth and you need complexity of defense. Just like attackers try to obfuscate what they try to do, we should also be obfuscating what we present forward. It's a defensive strategy, not just an offensive strategy. Um, and that really goes into, I also see, best practice recommendations in that question. Best practice recommendations, I recommend for any device. Cisco has hardening guides. If you become compromised, we have forensics guides. Uh, there are all kinds of ways to get documentation from whoever the product vendor is on hardening and best practices. But then there are also third party organizations that may do this as well and provide you with hardening guidance. Some of them specific configurations, CIS comes to mind, Center for Security, but then also general, like you may have other places that give you information, like your government or your regulatory agency or your standards organization says, hey, you should implement these controls as best practices.
Awesome. Uh, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah,
Uh, One of our attendees asked, how can we effectively implement least privilege access controls and microsegmentation to limit lateral movement and reduce the attack surface within our networks?
great question. That's a difficult one. The first thing you have to do is understand two things. What is in your network? Like what types of endpoints, what infrastructure, what designs, what architectures are in your network? Then also how that network needs to support the business is one of the things I mentioned is, I don't have a firewall just to have a firewall. I have a firewall because it protects applications that make the business money or protect things that make the organization's mission go forward. Uh, Once you've defined those, you can start mapping those out and coming up with a least intrusive way. I think the best way to get least privilege, especially when you talk about microsegmentation, is define your enclaves small. Don't have a ton of our enclaves. Every time you have a new enclave or a new group or a new segment, you're gonna have to have a new rule. If you can limit the number of rules, deduplicate your rules, you're gonna have a lot better time. So things like trust set can help, VXLAN can help. There are lots of different things you can use to segment, but for that least privilege access, you're gonna have to have things that define rules a little bit more dynamically and follow that. Hey, maybe some of my more, hammer and chisel controls can be closer inside the network and more my scalpel, my close uh, detail tools can be on the outside at the endpoints to protect them a little bit more in depth based on their specific situation. So some of these may come in different places. So dispersing that rule set properly is a big way of making sure that least privileges is given. Is your more broader controls in the middle and at the edges, even if that's in your data center edge, like the endpoint edge is where I'm talking about, that's where you're going to want to that's where you may have some more fine controls.
Awesome. And Dimitri made a comment about good security is like an onion. There are many layers.
Yep,
Truth to that.
just like an ogre.
Yeah. All right. Well, that covers our session for today. David, is there anything else you wanted to cover before we wrap up?
I just wanted to thank everyone for attending. Thanks for giving us your time. Our next session, please attend it. If you felt this one was lacking a little bit in the technical piece, more of these will start getting more in the technical. So really look forward to our other presenters and helping them out and being part of this. So thank you all for making this possible.
Awesome. Great. Thank you again, David. Thank you to the whole team for bringing your knowledge to the Cisco community. Again, if you have a question, I'll keep the Q&A window open for a couple more minutes. And also, I'm going to repaste the post-webinar discussion thread. You can also follow up and continue the conversation on the site there. I'll be posting the copy of the PDF slides as a PDF, downloadable PDF on there as well. And if you have, or if you'd like more tutorials, demonstrations, and future webinars, please do visit the Cisco Learning Network. So make sure to bookmark that. At this time, you'll be directed to a survey, so we do encourage you to take the time to participate. Once again, we thank everyone for joining us today, and we will see you next time. Have a great day.